This video is on chain sentences. Chain sentences are a form of transitions. When we think about transitions, we usually think of words such as along the same lines, equally, in comparison. These are ones that express similarity, and these are other transitions that have to do with contrast, such as although, but, and by contrast. To see them at work in a model paper, there's a paragraph here from the model paper involving the visual art comparison paper. However, the most effective transitions and the most unsung ones are chain sentences. Here are two texts. They both say the same thing. The content is the same, but they're worded a little bit differently. The syntax is very different between the two of them, how the sentences are arranged and so on. In class, we read them out loud and we voted on which one seems to be the easiest to read, which one makes the most sense. So pause the video and do the same thing. Read them both out loud and decide for yourself which seems to make the most sense, and get into a little bit why the one you think makes the most sense does. Look at specific instances of ideas being constructed. So pause the video now, and when you're done, turn it back on. In class, we voted that text B is the clearer text to read. The two paragraphs have the same first sentences, but thereafter things change. So, for instance, here, my eye fell upon one of the details of Gothic carving of which Flanders is full, knocked about and indecipherable, but in the style and tradition of the early Middle Ages. So we're reading that sentence and we don't know what it involves. I mean, it's a typical periodic sentence, right? But we're kind of knocked about ourselves, not knowing what is knocked about here. Only toward the end of the sentence do we get that it's carvings. On the other hand, on this sentence, we've got Gothic carving of which Flanders is full. Was the carving old? It was certainly knocked about and indecipherable, so that's clear from sentence to sentence what we're talking about. One more instance of how they differ. Down here in text A, the most vigorous time in all history, the 13th century, has been called. Sailors tugged at ropes, farm workers reaped corn, and women energetically poured something into something else. And so you're wondering, wait, these things happened in the 13th century? Okay, women energetically poured something into something else? Okay, I can buy that, but how does that make sense? Over here, however, it builds better. The carvings seem to represent people bending themselves to certain primary employments. Sailors tugged at ropes. So now we're not reading things that happened in the 13th century, but instead we're reading about specific ways in which people bent themselves to certain primary employments. This is an instance of what we're studying here, which is chain sentences. Text A does not have it, does not have them, but text B does. So let's look a little bit about what these chain sentences are. A chain sentence is simply a sentence that has something early in the sentence that refers to something earlier in the paragraph. That's all a chain sentence is. Has to be early in the sentence, and that thing that's early in the sentence has to refer to something earlier in the paragraph. So the requirements are those two. In this paragraph here that we just read, which was text B, every sentence is a chain sentence, except the first, of course, because there's nothing earlier in the paragraph before the first sentence. So I've circled something early in each sentence that refers to something earlier in the paragraph, which I placed a rectangle around. So it's color coordinated. The purple, very dark purple, circled is something early in, and in red is what it refers to that's earlier in the paragraph. So in the second sentence, was the carving old? Well, that carving there is something early in the sentence, right? Within 3 words of the beginning of the sentence. And it refers to something earlier in the paragraph. So now we see the definition of it. We'll look at a couple of more examples here in this paragraph. The next sentence begins with it. So it doesn't have to be the same word. Here it's a pronoun. It, of course, we know from the context, refers to carving. It's clear from the context. The next sentence begins with the word carving. The next sentence begins with sailors. Sailors themselves don't appear earlier in the paragraph, but it refers to something else earlier in the paragraph, people bending themselves to certain primary employments, sailors being an example of it. These subjects, that again refers to people bending themselves. And that is an account of each changed sentence in that paragraph. So the purpose of a changed sentence is simple. Don't let the reader get past the beginning of the sentence without reassurance that it connects with something that they have read earlier in the paragraph. Otherwise, they're doing too much at once. The reader carries too much in their head if they struggle to see how the sentence relates to what they've just read. So they're trying to take in the new information that a sentence always presents, and they're at the same time trying to discern the relevance of that new sentence to what's come before. And that's too much work. We should, as writers, do that second part for the reader. That is, we should always have something early in a sentence that refers to something earlier in the paragraph. So, a little theory here. While breath unit emphasis focuses on the last stressed syllable, changed sentences focus on the first words in a sentence. So they're kind of emphasizing different parts of a sentence. The strategies are not opposed to each other. They're built on the same truth. English sentences generally start with known material and end with new material. We know this works for breath units because readers expect to have new material toward the end of a breath unit, particularly toward the end of a sentence. And that's what makes it the most expensive real estate in a sentence. On the other hand, readers generally, whether they know it or not, expect to see known material at the beginning of a sentence. So, what we did in class was we worked through this paragraph, which is a little bit of the history of Shakespeare's writing of The Tempest. Some consider it his last play, written sometime around 1611. And we found something early in each sentence that refers to something earlier in the paragraph. So we did this with a Jamboard. But pause the video and see if you can work out a few instances of it. When you're ready, start the video and compare what you did with what we saw as a class. So here's what we saw in the class after we worked it out. The second sentence begins as a changed sentence. Remember, the first sentence can't be a changed sentence because there's nothing earlier. It begins with the storm. So we don't want to go any further than the subject part of the sentence. You don't want to get into the predicate unless it's super short, the sentence is super short, or it's passive voice. But here's a typical sentence, right? The storm had destroyed the ship off the Bermuda Islands and the passengers, blah, blah. Well, there's something early in the sentence, the word storm, that refers to something earlier in the paragraph. And you can see here, storm is circled and the arrow pointing back to something earlier. It's not the same word, it's tempest. It's a synonym for storm, of course. The next the next sentence begins, Shakespeare's Castaways. Well, we see there's a reference to Shakespeare earlier in the paragraph. Castaways, too, though the words aren't used, is practically defined at the end of the last sentence. Before castaways, passengers and crew had ended up on one of the islands. So there is a reference to something earlier in the paragraph, right? The next sentence, the actual castaways, again referring to that. And on it goes. Early in each sentence is something earlier in the paragraph in order to anchor the reader and to serve as a transition from one sentence to the next. So what we did in class as an exercise was each pair had a paragraph from the sample essay on a Jamboard, and you have received an invitation to work on this Jamboard. Your partner may have already begun to work on it, so you should go ahead and finish it off. It is a link to, with editing rights for you, to mark up a body paragraph from the sample essay for our visual art comparison paper. So take it, and using this as an example, mark it similarly. Circle in blue or purple something early in each sentence, and then put a rectangle in red around something that's earlier in the paragraph that something early in the sentence refers to, drawing an arrow to it. That's it. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.